Hey retro gamers. Today on Smashing Bricks, it's a particle acceleration experiment gone wrong in the 1991 cinematic action-adventure platformer Another World for the Commodore Amiga. Hey, welcome back to Smashing Bricks, a retro gaming podcast. My name is Eddie Inzauto, and today I'm joined by Neilan Naicker, aka the Orange Tank, my second guest in a row from the Board Game Barrage podcast. Amazing. How are you, Neilan?
I am doing great, Eddie. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Awesome. Yeah. I think, what did I give you? A small selection of games to choose from, and you saw this and got excited?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, there were a bunch of games that jumped out at me on the list, but this is one that had legitimately just been on my sort of eternal backlog for a very, very long time. And I thought, you know what? What better excuse to play a game that I've actually been itching to play for years than to, to talk about it in a retrospective sense. So yeah.
Yeah, kind of you have a board gaming podcast, and one thing you talk about a lot is the eternal shelf of shame that board gamers have. You feel like this was on your video game equivalent of that?
Absolutely. I'm exactly the sort of dork that maintains a spreadsheet of all the things I keep meaning to get around to. So I've had this Google sheet for a really long time, which is just divided into 3 columns of games I really, really want to play, games I may want to get around to at some point. And it's funny because the column that's the most curated is kind of the high priority queue, and Another World was genuinely on that. Admittedly towards the bottom, so chances are I was never actually going to get around to it naturally, but it was on that list for sure.
Oh wow, that's great. And so for you, when you I think you asked me to just send you that some smattering of games, I literally used a randomizer, an online number generator to go through my list, which is the Smashing Bricks retro games list, which I have shared with all the listeners, so you can make suggestions if you're listening to things that I don't have on there. So I did a random number generator for 5 or 6 games, and just luckily it came up. And I think I sent you the title Out of This World.
Right.
Which is interesting because anyone listening with their keen listening skills, they might know that you're not from New York or California, right? So you knew it as something else, I guess.
Totally, yeah. I'm from South Africa originally, and for the most part, we kind of share the sort of regioning distribution with Europe. So yeah, it's Another World, I guess, in the Europe distribution, which I guess it's originally a French game.
Yep. Yeah, so I guess that could take us right into some of the history of the game. It was originally a game designed for the Commodore Amiga, and then immediately the Atari ST, which were competing platforms. They were sort of, for American listeners, we didn't really have these at all. They were competing sort of personal computer / gaming platforms. You probably actually know a lot more about these than I do. Right?
They're still a little bit before my time. And it's funny because I have a really weirdly divergent perspective on some of this history. I had a really early computer. My mom had a really early computer from the early 80s. And then my next real computer was from the 1993 thereabouts. So yeah, this entire era of personal computing, I don't really know that much about, to be honest.
Yeah, me either. But so this was 1991 for the Commodore Amiga and the Atari ST. Then the next year, it hit MS-DOS in 1992. It had an extra section of gameplay added to the original. And then that was ported over to the much more prevalent home consoles of the Super Nintendo and the Genesis, also the Apple IIgs, which was a little bit more popular over here. And those were all brought to the world by Interplay, which is pretty famous for some of their early CRPGs, the like Fallout, for example. Interplay was pretty big back then, though it was originally published by Delphine Software, which was that French studio that the designer Eric Chahi worked for at the time.
Yeah, Interplay is one of those publishers that it's their logo around that era of like early DOS is just so ingrained in my memory for just like the number of games that they were stamped on around that time. Yeah, I wonder what actually happened to like at least the remnants of Interplay.
Oh, I'm not sure. I didn't look into that. I love their logo because they published Clay Fighter or Clay something. They published some of the Clay animation games, and their logo kind of looks like that too.
Okay,
splashed
nice.
across the screen. So first it was published by Delphine Software, and Eric Chahi, he's sort of an auteur behind this game. He did all the art, the design, programming, and really only had help with the music, which was great, by Jean-Francois Freitas. Later on, extra music was added to the Interplay version by Charles Deenan. But Chahi had worked on Future Wars, which was released in 1989 with Paul Cuisset, who was the designer of Flashback later on, the next year after this game came out. And that was a successful game, which allowed him to take a break from the company's next game and do his own thing. So he spent 2 whole years pretty much to creating another world, and took influences from a bunch of different things that he was interested in and made his own story in a game which was very different from the majority of what was out there, right? So what was this game like?
It's funny because like I you're exactly right, and just like trying to picture like the sorts of games that were around in the era, and like I'm only just imagining. And again, my perspective is very, very specific on this, but like there's the smattering of adventure games out in PC, but you're typically dealing with like either very typical sci-fi or fantasy in the realm of stuff like, King's Quest and stuff like that. Or, the sort of generic fantasy that kind of like permeated like so much of like the early NES and SNES games, like especially through like Japanese RPGs. But this was like this really weird, hey, we're going to take design effectively a completely unique world and sort of have this fish out of water scenario for the game, for the storyline in it. Pretty weird compared to like what was out there at the time.
I hadn't really considered a lot of it, but this was sort of the same era as a lot of those adventure games, sort of like the LucasArts games. They had a very particular style of play with sort of the static backgrounds, and you moved your guy around and clicked on things, whereas this took a whole different approach of action platforming.
Totally. And one of the things I actually thought was interesting when I was kind of digging into the game after I finished it is apparently there was a point in time during the production. And, like you said, one of the things that's just wild about this game is it's literally basically a one-man team for 2 years. And somewhere towards, I think, the second half development, Interplay says, hey, what maybe this would be better as a point-and-click adventure, because like you said, that was what was in vogue at the time. And Chahi was just like, no, I cannot possibly redesign the game to like be that at this point.
Because it was a very special sort of game. He did a lot of groundbreaking things at the time. So I said he took influence from a variety of sources, and some of the ones that were cited were Dune for this sort of sci-fi atmosphere, Dragon Ball for interestingly like doing some effects, like when a character moves, he just turns into a bunch of lines to get to the area he's going, trying to say a lot with a little, that sort of thing. Star Wars, with obviously this game includes enemies shooting ray guns at you, and that's essentially your main weapon throughout the game. And one that I noticed while playing, it stuck out to me was, oh, this feels a little bit like Dragon's Lair. And when I
Absolutely.
was playing, it felt like Dragon's Lair in a negative way, which we'll get to.
Totally.
But the influence is obvious.
Yeah, totally. And I had the exact same reaction, almost to a surprising degree, because one of the things is, this is a game that I feel gets cited a lot, and it was a game that I had recommended to me a lot, but I didn't really know what to expect. Like, I actually thought it was more of a point-and-click adventure until I started playing it. And suddenly, when you have these very, multi-screen action sequences where one fail dumps you all the way back to the start of the sequence, I was like, is this just Dragon's Lair? I had the exact same reaction.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so funny. This was a roller coaster for me, this whole play experience, which makes it super interesting, and we'll talk a lot about that. But as far as that Dragon's Lair influence, you're right. Like, you just have to kind of react to something that is absolutely predetermined in the mind of the designer and figure out what you have to do to get the game to advance. But this one had a little bit more, you have a little bit more agency in it. It's more of an action game and more of a platformer. But as far as the influence from Dragon's Lair, aside from that gameplay, it was the way it was presented, in that game had these fully animated sprites that would go from frame to frame, and Jahi liked that. But that takes a lot of storage because every one of those has to be drawn out. So he essentially created a vector animation system using flat polygon outlines and instructions to fill them and scale them and move them around on screen. And it totally worked.
This is the part that kind of blew my mind. And I didn't realize it necessarily as I was playing it. Like, some of it is apparent. It has that, it's not 3D technically, but it has that look of early 3D, and entirely because the entire construction of the game is just based on, like you said, moving polygons, moving shapes that are effectively all just flat colored, flat shaded. And to, in terms of establishing what his goal was, which is how do I create that style of game like Dragon's Lair, but on hardware that just simply doesn't have the memory for it. Because, I don't know too much about how Dragon's Lair shipped, but I assume you're talking about games that, this is a game that was in the Laserdisc era of consoles. So the storage capacity, the memory capacity in order to be able to run that game is very different from the consoles, or rather the computers that Shahi's developing this on in the case of Another World. So it's just such a smart decision to be like, hey, I'm going to try recreate that style of game, but in as minimalist a way as possible, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Dragon's Lair shipped on 1 million discs that you had to swap out throughout playing.
That doesn't surprise me, because that's given how high quality the caliber of the animation was for that era. I guess that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and there were even limitations on how many of these they're polygons, right? But they're flat polygons. How many of these the system could display at a time? And when you look at the visuals, you see what appears to be hundreds of them, many hundreds of them in the backgrounds and everything. But what he managed to do, instead of making everything out of these polygons, is he would make the backgrounds and flatten them out, and then only put a few in the foreground that were moving. And one example I saw when I was researching this was, even in the opening cinematic, he drives in his Ferrari, and as you come into the scene, the Ferrari is a moving polygon, and it parks, but once it stops moving, it becomes assimilated into a background graphic and is no longer part of this moving graphics engine. So he would do things like that. He would make elements stop and then stick to the background so that he could incorporate more stuff moving in the game.
There's something else I thought that was really fun when I dug into this, which is he can kind of tell, especially in the opening of the game, how much detail there is in the backgrounds, and rapidly that detail diminishes as the game progresses, just because of how tedious it was to construct those backgrounds. And as he's running out of time, it's just I cannot devote this much time to individually laying out polygons for every small point of detail in every background.
Yeah. I think I didn't realize that while playing, but I totally get it now that you say it. And we'll talk about the individual levels too and point that out again. What else? So contemporary titles we talked about. Delphine Software followed this up with a game that looked very similar and used kind of some of the same ideas as far as development goes. Flashback came the following year, and it looked a lot like this game. And prior to this was Prince of Persia, which I feel like anytime you mention Another World, you should mention Prince of Persia, which came out in 1989. However, I couldn't find a single instance of Chahi citing this as an influence, which is really strange. I even found an interview where both he and Jordan Mechner, the designer of Prince of Persia, were in the same interview, and he never mentioned, yeah, and of course, thanks to Prince of Persia, I got this idea.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, that seems like one of those things that's sort of just like an unsaid fact to some extent. I mean, because, when I think about 2D platformers that heavily relied on rotoscoping for animation, like Prince of Persia is the one I think about. So it would surprise me if that wasn't just paramount in his mind as he's making this. There's also just something about the way that the character in Another World moves. There's a little bit of a slide to his run sometimes that is very reminiscent to Prince of Persia.
Yeah, and you have to finish the run animation before doing the jump animation.
Yes.
Which is sort of like a stepping leap, which is just iconically Prince of Persia to me. And otherwise, this at the same time as this was all the early Super Nintendo games from 1990 and 91, and Genesis, which came out in 88, 89, which were totally different, except for maybe that the Super NES introduced the background scaling effects like Mode 7, which was the closest thing to this vector graphic system that he made. But as far as how the world received it at the time, it seemed like it was revolutionary and people saw it as such. Coming back to it now, having not really been involved with the game a lot at the time of release, it's hard to see, but then it seemed like it was a huge deal. For example, CVG gave it a 94%. Amiga Action, Amiga Power, and Amiga Computing Magazine, which I have no idea about, they all gave it an 89%. Superplay and Commodore User Amiga, 91%. Game rankings for the SNES version, 84% average. Later on, when the game was re-released, those scores progressively lowered.
Which makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, of course. You can see it aging. Yeah. And also people not understanding what it was at the time, looking at it in the lens of when it was released versus looking at it just by itself.
Absolutely. I stumbled across a review. I definitely don't want to call out the specific outlet. I stumbled across a review for I must have been either the 15th or the 20th anniversary edition that just straight up called it a bad game. And it's one of those things where it's like, I understand when you're coming from when you view it through a modern lens. There's an element of frustration to this game that is not very prevalent in modern game design. But yeah, it's hard not to imagine people just being blown away by how different it was back in 91. I mean, one of the things I kept seeing come up again and again when people talk about this game retrospectively is effectively describing it as the birth of cinematic video gaming adventures. And that's kind of a striking thing. Like, when I think about some of my favorite modern games to play, like that's a genre, like the cinematic action adventure. That's one I have a lot of affinity for. And to think that it could all be traced back to something as innovative as Another World back in 91, I mean, that's a big deal.
Yeah, he clearly wanted to do something different with video games that was not being done. He wanted to tell this story. And throughout the game, he does things where he creates very specific set pieces with a very small set of player abilities and just kind of curates what he's allowing to happen on screen in a very interesting way.
Right. I mean, you just think about like how few interactions there are in the game in terms of you've got to run, you've got to jump, you have an action button, which most of the time is just shoot your gun, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, the action button and the run button are the same. The shoot button
Right.
and the run button. Yeah. One last thing before we get on to our histories, which we kind of have revealed, is the legacy, the re-releases and the remakes. In '94, which was just a couple years after the initial ports onto the other home consoles, we got Heart of the Alien, Out of This World Parts 1 and 2 on Sega CD. And I think Heart of the Alien has since been sort of denounced as not canon in the game or something like that.
Interesting.
But I don't know a whole lot about the Sega CD version. Then nothing until 2004 when Chahi got the rights back because Delphine closed. And then he approved a mobile and pocket PC version in 2005 and 2006. Then there was that 15th anniversary edition in 2006, which increased the resolutions, which I should say, the original game had a resolution of 320 by 200. Oh my God. Can you imagine?
It's
On
kind
our
of
screen,
wild.
that's like a square on a spreadsheet.
But the thing that's kind of nuts about it though is so I at some point looked at, hey, let's see these two scenes side by side, how it would have looked on the original Amiga, how it looks on the 20th anniversary edition. And it is, despite the fact that obviously you're looking at an image that's much more grainy and much more low resolution, it's still pretty striking. Like, it doesn't look that different in terms of look and feel. Like, the effort that's made to make this the 20th anniversary edition, at least, like as preservationist as possible, like basically looking exactly how it looked in the original, only with the higher resolution edges. Because, like we said earlier, like this is a polygonal game in terms of like how the image is made up. So all you do is smooth out those those edges rather, and you just get a much cleaner looking game. But it's pretty reminiscent of the original in a way that really surprised me.
Yeah. Yeah, that 20th anniversary edition is pretty incredible. That was ported by .emu for iOS and Android in 2011 and 12, and then onto Steam and GOG in 2013. There was also a Jaguar port that was supposed to be released in 1994, and then finally got a cartridge release in 2013 with a rewritten engine for the Atari Jaguar, which is just, it's funny and cool and kind of like, I don't know, heartwarming in a way. Whenever a cartridge gets released a decade or more, 2 decades after. I think there was a Super Nintendo game released like that at some point in the aughts as well.
Yeah, I remember hearing and there was actually maybe not that long ago, like in the last few years, that was just
maybe the
hey, we are going to do a limited edition release of this cartridge that just never got released in the US or something like that. I forget exactly what the story was, but I love stuff like that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And then finally the game got released on Xbox One, PS3, PS4, PS Vita, Wii U, Nintendo 3DS in 2014. And this was all super up-resed. You could go as high as 2560 by 1600 from that 320 by 200. And then it got a double pack on PS4, Switch, and Xbox One in 2020 along with Flashback. So we've been calling it Another World. US gamers, all North American gamers knew this as Out of This World, because when it was released originally, they changed the name to avoid confusion with a soap opera that we had called Another World, which I never heard of. Meanwhile, there was a TV show, like a sitcom called Out of This World on TV at the same time, so it didn't really matter. And I actually knew about that. It's like the dad was from another planet and the girl was half alien.
Did they rename it to the name of a more popular show? That's pretty funny.
I think that it's possible. I mean, I'm not really big in the soap opera scene, so I don't know how popular Another World was, especially not in 1991 when I was 7. But yeah, that struck me as funny that they renamed it to something that was already there.
Yeah, the real point of contention was the soap opera was about a scientist that accidentally transported himself to an alien planet. It was really bizarre as a premise for a soap opera, but they couldn't live with that source of confusion.
Yeah. Oh my god, that would be funny. Um, okay, so that is everything that we wanted to talk about as far as the history of the game, its development, reception.
I will say one thing really quickly while we're talking about this
Hmm.
sequel that seems to have died on the Sega CD. That kind of struck me as kind of a bummer. It's not like I was itching for more Another World, but I did have this pang of like, oh, maybe I'll check out the sequel. But yeah, it doesn't seem like it's at all possible to play it because it never got re-released anywhere else.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, one of the criticisms of this game was that it was very short.
Hmm.
I mean, it depends on who you are and how you play it, because it could be very long. It could take you 30 years to finish it, which we'll talk about right now. I played this game in 1991 or 2 or
No
3, something
way.
like that. Yeah, on the Super Nintendo, which I didn't mention, the Interplay releases had extra music added in, which is really cool. I played the Super Nintendo version this time also, but we'll talk about a little bit more of that in a bit. But I also played it on the Super Nintendo. Originally, I went to my local game store, rented the game, and tried to play it and failed. I'm almost 100% certain I did not get past the opening scene because I couldn't figure out what I needed to do. And maybe not that I couldn't figure it out, but that it was so frustrating that I didn't really want to figure it out. I mean, I was playing Super Mario World at this time.
I think you
So,
made the better choice.
yeah, like how do I reconcile in my brain smashing my head up against these 4 screens of death when I could just go play Mario?
I mean, that's kind of the thing. I think 4 screens of death is a pretty good summary of just kind of like how oppressive this game feels at times. Because one of the very first things that happens in the game, like, there's this beautiful like cinematic intro sequence, and then you're kind of just dumped or teleported like underwater, and there's no prompt on screen, nothing to tell you to do anything, and if you just continue to watch the screen, your character sinks to the bottom and dies. And it's just kind of
Hmm.
like that's kind of a good intro for everything that's to follow, because as soon as you figure out that you need to like swim to the surface. If you stand still too long, your character dies. If you step on the wrong thing on the next screen, your character dies. It's just this constant, hey, here are all the ways that we are going to brutally murder you until you figure out how to get past these 4 screens.
Right. Yeah. And I have extensive notes about how I died and how frustrating it was and how my experience evolved throughout the time. So that was my history. Was I played it in 1991 on the Super Nintendo and never really played it again. I might have checked back in here and there and done the same thing, been like, I don't really know what to do here, and not been committed enough to try to seek out whatever the experience was that I had been missing. And I think you were pretty clear that you didn't even know what the game was, so that means you had never tried it, right?
So I had definitely never played it. Now here's the thing that actually kind of surprised me when I fired it up. There are 100% moments in this game that I have committed to memory. And I just mean like visually. I had not. I genuinely hadn't remembered that I had seen this game being played. But one of the things that struck me as interesting was I must have just watched my brother play it at various points and just kind of largely forgotten it. Like, I didn't really remember any
Mm,
gameplay sequences or solutions or anything like that, but I have 100% seen this on my PC, on my home PC, like probably back in like 92, 93, at a point in time that my brother was just playing a lot of different video games and I was mostly just relegated to watching him play them. But yeah, that is the
mm.
extent of my history with it, is just having seen it being played in the dark, dark holes of my memory.
Wow. The classic brother playing games story. Are
I
you the
yeah,
younger brother?
I am the younger brother in that situation. It's funny. I listened to Mark's appearance on the show, and he kind of said the same thing, and I just had this little back of my head, like, yeah, that was much of my gaming gaming recollection of that period of time was just watching my brother play video games.
Very cool. About how old were you at the time of this game's release, if you don't mind me
So
asking?
yeah, 91, I would have been 5 years old. So,
Mhm.
there was that early computer we had from the 80s. I was definitely playing games on that, but they're like really, really simple, like Space Invaders, that sort of thing. But I wasn't really
Right.
playing adventure games so much as always just like being fascinated by, again, watching my brother play them. Kind of, I had this weird like fear about, especially this type of game. And this is actually one of the things that kind of struck me as I was playing it. A game where you could die in multiple different ways if you weren't quick enough or fast enough. And this was kind of true a lot of those like early, those Sierra adventure games like Space Quest. I wouldn't ever want to play them if there was the fear that I was going to die. And that was kind of the
Yeah.
reason I just watched my brother play them.
Well, this was one of those for sure.
Very much.
Okay, so that covers our history, the game's history. Now we played it again in 2022. Which version did you play for this?
So I played the 20th anniversary edition, and it's one of those things where I'm generally very reticent not to play a game the way that it was originally presented, originally intended. But in this case, it kind of just felt like like I mentioned earlier, that there wasn't really that much of like a graphics overhaul. Like it was very preservationist, other than like the resolution and like the sound quality. So I kind of
Hmm.
felt comfortable that I was getting close to the original experience with the 20th anniversary edition.
Okay. Yeah, so for me, I started by comparing the Super Nintendo and Genesis versions because I had no way to access the Amiga or Atari ST
Mm,
versions. And the Super Nintendo version to me seemed to suffer from a lot of slowdown. And sadly, that's what I ultimately played the game for the full playthrough on, because I ran into some problems. I switched over to the Genesis version, which seemed to run more smoothly and seemed to have slightly cleaner, crisper graphics and better sound, which
okay.
I am loath to admit because I was a Super Nintendo kid. So I started playing the Genesis version, and I got to a point where I got stuck, which was not uncommon throughout this entire playthrough. And I resorted to watching a playthrough on YouTube and like going to the part where I was stuck and seeing what the guy did there and then saying, oh, that's what I didn't figure out. And then stopping it and continuing. But in the Genesis version, the game just would not do what was done on this Amiga walkthrough I was watching. It just didn't
Weird.
work. Um, and I'll tell
Is
you
that
when that
because of
was.
anything that was like specifically actually changed for those versions? Or just like weird glitchy behavior?
I think it was glitchy behavior because I ran into a few other glitches later in the game.
Interesting. Interesting.
So after that, I switched over to the Super Nintendo version, finished out the Super Nintendo version, realized that these home versions had an entirely additional section of the game added that was not on the original Amiga or Atari ST that has
Really?
survived in all of the following versions. And I finished the game there. Then I realized that the game was available as the 20th anniversary edition, looked for it on Steam, saw that it's right now available for $1.99, 80% off for the Steam Winter
What?
Sale.
I think I
Bought it.
paid $10 for it.
Yep, probably. That's its normal price. So I bought it, and then I played it again immediately, and the difference in the gameplay is like night and day. It is
Interesting.
so smooth on Steam on that 20th anniversary edition. It is like an entirely different game to me.
So, did you get the sense that it was just like frame rate stuff, like performance, or is there control stuff that kind of felt like it got ironed out more?
I feel there is control stuff that was ironed out more
Interesting.
slightly, but primarily because the game ran so slowly on the Super Nintendo that my
Right.
inputs had lag
Oh,
or
God.
things that wouldn't work. I wrote it down in my notes that it's plagued by slowdown and unresponsive / over responsive inputs.
I will
That was
say
a
this,
big
that
deal.
even I had frequent moments, even on 20th anniversary edition, on a gaming, gaming laptop, and obviously more than capable of running the game, where I kind of just felt like I was getting like unresponsive behavior from the controls. Kind of just sometimes I get the sense, and this is the typical excuse of anyone that's failing at things multiple times, feeling like I was pushing the button and the thing that I expected to happen wasn't happening. I don't know. Maybe that could just be a legacy of the way that the game is scripted, designed, what have you. I'm not sure. But yeah, I still kind of felt that a little bit on my end.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you this much. My first play being on the Super Nintendo, then finding that $1.99 version on Steam, I decided, let me just try this real quick. And I finished the game in 40 minutes.
Okay, well, Steam. Fantastic.
Whereas the Super Nintendo version, if I didn't use save states and save scumming, I would never have finished it. There were just parts where it was too difficult to do the things that were necessary, especially in combat. Like I would have these pincher attacks between guys, and you have to put up these walls and then shoot beyond them and knock out the other guy's defensive shield and then shoot him. There was no way I could do all of that so perfectly in a single run that I feel I could have gotten it right, especially after each death bringing me back so far, having to redo 10 minutes of gameplay just to get back to that spot to try again.
So this probably becomes the one part where I feel like I got a slightly or very inauthentic experience from playing the 20th anniversary edition, because I didn't realize until you mentioned it earlier that they had added more checkpoints to these later versions, because that strikes me. Look, I was frustrated with the checkpointing as it was in the 20th anniversary edition, so I can't imagine having to fail a sequence and then being reset that far back. That sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, it would have been. So I would definitely have rage quit the Super Nintendo version at many, many junctures throughout the game had I not had those save states. So that 20th anniversary edition, it does have a settings menu where you can change the difficulty from easy, medium, and hard. And I don't know what that actually affects, whether it's the number of enemies on screen or if it has to do with that checkpointing system. Maybe the hard mode has the original checkpointing system. Maybe the easy mode gives you the BioShock method where you just pop up in the most recent Vita chamber, the nearest checkpoint being one screen ago or two screens ago.
I wonder, because I actually thought that it was doing like some interesting things with checkpoints, because one of the things, actually, there's a point in the game fairly early where you get into what feels like the first really, really large-scale puzzle that's just sprawled across multiple screens. And it was doing something pretty interesting with checkpointing, where after each completion of a specific objective, it would checkpoint me, which until that point has just been like location-based, if that makes sense. So yeah, I wonder if that is...
Because we're spoiler heavy here. So
okay,
you could be
so
specific.
totally. So it's basically once you get to like the tunnels. So there's, the game starts off and you get captured very quickly in a prison. You break out of this prison and you sort of come across this series of like underground caverns. And that kind of becomes this elaborate puzzle of, if I remember correctly, of like flooding the chambers and then escaping back up before the water floods. But there are specific points and little objectives you have to do before that in terms of allowing the water to flow to certain locations, and you can go points along that path and it will checkpoint you, and then you kind of get to positions where you kind of feel like, well, maybe I don't want to go this route anymore, but you're kind of checkpointed in an annoying path. But once you sort of do an objective and get back, it sort of re-checkpoints you at that same location. So it was doing pretty dynamic, interesting checkpointing, I felt, which I have to imagine would have been the thing that was very different from the original release.
Oh yeah. So to use that same example, this part of the game requires you to go down to a bottom level of these caves and go all the way to one side and open up a wall by blasting through it. And I should say that you get a gun early on, which we can come back to and talk about a little bit, but you get this gun that fires blaster beams from Star Wars. If you hold the button a little bit longer, it puts up a sort of energy shield that can resist a number of shots before it goes away or it times out. or if you hold it extra long, it shoots like a Mega Buster that destroys walls and destroys shields. And you have to use that to break open this wall that leads into a very large pool. And you don't know why at first, because it's just a wall, but you figure, you got to break it. I didn't go to that. Then there's another level up where you have to leap across these perilous gaps and mouths on the floor that kill you and tentacles on the ceiling that kill you. And you go over there and you have to destroy a different part where there's a large body of water above you coming from this waterfall that's even above that on some different screens that is impassable, and you die the second you walk in it. So I thought, we destroy this, the water rushes away, then I can cross. Great, that's the puzzle. I did that. I spent tons of time trying to escape this water as it rushed out, chasing me back to the left, leaping over these mouths, leaping over these pit traps, and then getting spouted up to the next level above. Now the bottom 2 levels are completely inaccessible. And I continued on my way. I played a lot more of the game here. It's like many, many minutes of going across that previously impassable waterfall into a sort of building full of guards with pretty difficult combat where you get attacked from multiple directions. You have to do some puzzling to allow your previously captured comrade, your buddy, to let him continue through. And you go pretty far, and then you get back to where that large container was that I mentioned before. And having not broken the wall all the way at the bottom, all the way back, the water could not go and fill that, which was the puzzle that needed to be done. So I got there and I said, I'll just jump in. Jumped in, fell to my death, and saw, there's a wall there. How far back do I have to go and do this?
Oh, geez.
So I had to go and replay the entire area. But with the 20th anniversary edition, I noticed in some later levels that they would checkpoint you deeper into the game, and then if you had missed something, they would like de-checkpoint you to satisfy the prerequisite action so that you could continue and move on with the story. And it was really interesting, like you said. It was a very interesting dynamic checkpointing system that allowed you to progress down one path, hit your wall like you're supposed to, but then once you realize that, checkpoint you backwards to the point where you could fix that progression mistake.
Right.
I thought that was really cool.
And it was actually a thing that, and I think that's actually probably, I would be struggling to remember part of the game that's more egregious than the one you just described. But that was actually a part of the nature. Totally. But the nature of the dynamic checkpointing actually really confused me for that exact reason. Because kind of the same thing happened to me. Because it's very, I can't imagine anyone accidentally breaking that wall in the correct sequence and then stumbling across the pool later. But then I kind of had this moment of like, okay, wait, no, hang on. It's now checkpointing me back here. So I kind of ran around the bottom, found that wall. But then when I went back up to the top, like all the guards were gone. So it was doing this kind of, like you said, in the interest of not having me have to restart the game, but in a way that kind of broke the logic of the continuum of the story, as it were. But it's one of those quality of life things that didn't really make sense, but kind of, I guess, you have to do when you're just doing a game with checkpoints rather than saves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found the entire presentation of that newer version so much more agreeable to like actually having fun. It's a total different experience. Sure. But also I knew the game from having just played it. So there was that too.
You did answer a question that I was curious about, though, which was if it is possible, and it doesn't seem like it would be, if it would be possible to get yourself into a state where you just couldn't progress, because that was incredibly common in that era of adventure games, but it doesn't really seem like that is possible. And I don't know if that's something that changed for the later editions. I'd be curious to dig into that.
Well, you can get yourself to a point where you can't go any further, and you just have to die, and it sends you back to the beginning of the level, and you redo everything.
Oh, I just mean if you would ever have to restart the game, but I don't think so.
No, not that I could tell, and I did a lot of dying.
Mm.
Speaking of which, let's rewind to the beginning, to that opening scene, which actually has some instruction in the manual. I read the Super Nintendo instruction booklet, as I like to do for a lot of these old games, because it helps. And it was a very sparse booklet, but it did have a walkthrough of the first area, which is great and wasn't included in my rentals back then. So, what, for people who didn't get to play the game along with the show, can you sort of describe that first sequence and all the points where you can meet death and failure and have to do trial and error, just to sort of give an idea of some of the sequence that is possible?
Yeah, totally. So
you don't have to do this with all of them, but this gives like the general point.
Right. Of the way that the puzzles generally tend to work in this. Yeah. So, after you have this elaborate intro sequence, you're basically teleported underwater into what just looks like this endless pool of water on an alien planet. And like I mentioned earlier, if you don't do anything, if you don't interact, you just sort of sink to the bottom and the tentacle monster comes up and grabs you. So first possible death right there. What you're intended to do
is press up immediately.
Really?
You can't even wait a second, or else it'll catch you as you're swimming up too.
Yeah, I don't think I even noticed that. I must have just like at some point just started jamming on the up button. But yeah,
that could be different in the new version too.
Possibly. Once you get to the surface, you start to notice the tentacles start to like creep out of the water towards you, so you can't stand still in one place for too long. There's a thing that I always tend to do in this style of game, which is go left first instead of going right. So you go left, you see like this hanging vine, you can kind of jump onto it, but doesn't really do anything. And then you sort of if you come back the other way, the first thing that starts to happen, which is kind of your first little bit of environment hazarding, there are these kind of like slug-like things that kind of drop from the ceiling onto the ground. And I don't know if there's any way, I guess you don't have your gun at that point, so probably not, but you can just jump over them, right? So you jump over them. If you step on one of them
too.
Oh, really? I don't think I realized that.
Yeah, the action button does a kick too. Yep, it's the same shoot button.
I don't think I ever noticed that. Or ever, do you have to ever use that for any puzzles?
Later on, not. You get involved in a sort of cinematic that incorporates the kick that you wouldn't think is actually part of the standard controls.
That's fair. I think I know which bit you mean.
The kick is in that first scene to kill those little slugs.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I was just jumping over them.
And what happened when you missed your jump, which you probably did 10 times?
Yeah, a bunch of times. They rear up, stab you with their little poison tooth, and you fall over and die. So that's a fun little death moment number 3 that can happen in another world. Then let's say you've managed to jump over these guys. You get to the next screen. Suddenly you're faced with, I don't even know how to describe this, like some sort of like bull type bear thing, which kind of like jumps out of the background, roars at you very aggressively. And actually one of the things, the touches I think is quite cool in this, the game is kind of like interspersed with these very quick little cutscenes. They're like a second long, but like this introduction to this beast is it just like bellowing in your face for like half a second. And then it just
big
charges
close up on
you
its
down.
face.
Yeah, exactly. And given like the context of the time, like again, the fact that these are not done through like detailed animated sequences like a la Dragon's Lair, but they're just in this minimalist like vector style, very, very effective. And given like how few colors are used in the game overall, also just really, really impressive. But that thing starts charging you down, and if that hits you, you get treats to a nice little quick cinematic of it jumping at you and goring you. Oh, this is the other thing, actually. Every one of these deaths actually is accompanied by one of these little quick cinematics. So you get, gory, getting torn apart by tentacle things constantly, things charging at you, quick close-ups of the slug things rearing up and biting you. So that's pretty much the extent of the reach of that first puzzle area. So you have the starting screen, the slug screen, the bull screen, and that's pretty much it. And you're tasked with basically how do you survive this bull charging at you? And all you can really do is run back to the slug screen, at which point a bunch more slugs have kind of dropped down from the ceiling. So you're going to be trying to jump over them if you're like me and don't realize you can kick things, apparently, multiple times, dying in what's pretty hilarious fashion, falling over poisoned as the bull charges past you. And yeah, I guess you run all the way back to the left, and then that vine, that real critical vine that was on the leftmost screen, comes into play here. You jump onto the vine, swing out of the way, and if I remember correctly, you kind of swing back on the vine, jump over the bull, and then run back the other direction. Is that how that works? I forget.
Yeah. You go back one screen to the right, and now you're like, well, I guess I'll run to the right now.
Right. And then you basically get back to the screen where the bull first appears, and you can kind of just run past it. I guess I'm struggling to remember now. Over like a jump, I presume, to like get to safety.
No, you run into the inhabitants of this world who shoot the thing chasing
who shoot it
you.
down. That's right.
And
that's
then
right.
Lester, our hero, says hi, waves his hand. He doesn't say anything, but he makes a hello gesture, and then they shoot him.
Right.
And that takes you to the next part of the game where you're locked in a cage suspended above a pit with another one of this other creature.
And this is like the point in the game where it like starts to click, like the sort of game I've kind of signed myself up to play, because I sort of, at this point I realized, okay, this is a game of this sort of like trial by error action sequence, and repeat until you're able to execute it perfectly. And I have to admit, like, this is kind of the point where my heart just dropped a little bit, because there are modern equivalents of this type of game that I think are done especially well. I am a huge fan of Limbo and Inside, which kind of feel like very, very close modern versions of this style of game. But I think those games are a lot more generous with, well, kind of the checkpointing we were talking about earlier. I don't think any one of those games ever throws you back more than one screen, whereas Another World kind of expects you to be able to execute the whole sequence perfectly.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reminded of Limbo around this point as well, or a little bit after. I was like, oh yeah, this is what a lot of people who are not fans of Limbo will cite as what makes it a bad game, is that it's all about trial and error. However, in Limbo, there is almost always a visual cue on the screen that alerts you to what the possible dangers could be. Whereas in this game, there is not. The only way that you learn what's going to happen in Another World is by having it happen, dying, and then knowing that you have to avoid doing that thing.
Right. I also think, and this is kind of very indicative of like some of the ways that game design has changed in the intervening years. Limbo and Inside both kind of signpost puzzles through, kind of like traditional training. Like they will show you the solution in some simpler form earlier in the game and then expect you to re-execute on that solution to solve a puzzle. Another World doesn't do any of this. Like kind of the thing you were talking about, like, yeah, just shoot this arbitrary wall. Maybe it'll be important later. Like that is kind of every puzzle in Another World.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you see a wall like that a little bit earlier, but you don't know that it's the same thing. I don't know. It's hard to justify some of it. If I were like trying to play devil's advocate for the designer, it's really just trial and error.
I think to some extent that there is like, when again, this is so reminiscent of so many adventure games I played around that time that I understand the appeal. Like I remember feeling like it was an accomplishment where I kind of spent days batting my head against the puzzle, quote unquote puzzle, or just what arbitrary obstruction, only to like find the solution through like random happenstance or just trying every damn thing. And then something clicks and something works. And that there is like a thrill that was associated with that. Like, oh my God, I'm at the next screen. I did it. I found the way to get through this. And I can see how that would have resonated with people back then, but it's definitely a hard pill to swallow in 22.
Yeah, and then you run into things even just soon after this. You come down from this jail cell, this cage, by swinging back and forth and landing on a guard. You pick up his gun, and now you're armed with the only weapon you have for the rest of the game. You continue through this cell block, and you immediately come to an unopenable door that your friend, who is another one of this species of person, who's kind of like a Ninja Turtle without a shell and gray tan, right? He has that sort of Ninja Turtle-y face.
Yeah, and they kind of don't seem to have any necks. They're just all head and torso.
Yeah, they're funny. Definitely brutish, ogreish, or orcish. So he tries to open up this door, and now you have to fend off enemies. And you just kind of get killed over and over till you realize the one way that you're going to be fighting enemies for the duration of the game that actually works. And that is you put up a shield by using your gun's secondary function. You watch your opponent put up his shield. You stand behind your shield so your gun sticks out in front of it slightly. You charge up your Mega Buster shot to knock out his shield and immediately follow it up with a standard blaster shot to kill him. Is that basically what you did for the entirety of the game? Because that's what I did.
I won't lie. I think it took me until very late in the game to like register that sequence as like the definitive way to solve every combat puzzle in the game. I think I largely kind of fudged my way through a lot of the early combat because it took a long time for me to like kind of try figure out what the design intent was, because I kind of felt like I would sometimes just shoot and it kind of feels like bullets sometimes just arbitrarily miss both you and the enemies. So there's a little bit of this like, you know, Star Wars as a reference point makes a lot of sense because it's kind of that stormtrooper fire of just like firing 5 shots and one of them connects. But there's no real rhyme or reason to it as far as I could tell. So I think I was just kind of like randomly smashing the shoot button and putting up shields and kind of stumbling through most of those fights in the beginning.
Got it. Yeah, well, same. I mean, ultimately, it's the same takeaway message is that you're struggling to get it to work over and over.
Totally. Yeah. I think the thing is like by the time late in the game where the combat's yet intense enough that you have to refine that method that you kind of just described, you know, at that point, you're slowly been learning the ins and outs of the combat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess that's true. Now that I think about it, that first hallway, what I really did was I stood on the edge of the screen so that when the guy came in from the left and put up his shield, I just stuck my gun past his and shot him over and over. Whenever I saw their blasters coming, I would just be shooting. And then he unlocks the door, you run through. You have this elevator section, you go up, you see a bunch of the world, which really doesn't do anything but places you know, in the world so you understand what's out there. And then here's the part where my Genesis run failed. So you can go down 2 levels and back to the left, and one of them is the way forward, and you have to break through a wall or door and then go down a short teleporter and run out to the left. Meanwhile, there's a guard below you behind the door that he can open and just start shooting constantly, and you can never get past. In the 20th anniversary edition, which I played, and luckily I did, because otherwise I would have zero understanding of what was going on, you go down another level on the elevator and you shoot an electrical wire, I guess, which prevents that door from opening. Is that what that was?
That's exactly right.
But on the Genesis and Super Nintendo version, instead of that electrical circuit on that bottom level, there's just a guard. And you shoot him. And my assumption was that he has something to do with that door opening. Or if there was an electrical line there, I was not aware of it. And I didn't shoot again to like shoot the wall because it was not obvious. So when I played the Genesis version, I killed the guard below, went up to the middle level, and there was no way to get past this other guard. Meanwhile, in the Super Nintendo version, which again may have just been an arbitrary result of not shooting an extra shot down in the lower level and destroying this thing, I was able to go past because the guard there would get stuck behind the door that couldn't open. Or
weird.
Or I really thought it was just like a pathing thing where if I blew up the door above him, his attention was to the right side of the screen, so I had to take advantage of his slight stutter timing to go quickly to the left. So that was a point where I felt like there was a glitch.
That's interesting. I would be so curious to like dig into what the actual difference there is between those versions. Because yeah, it makes me wonder if that circuit does exist on the earlier versions, except it's just not visually discernible in any real way. Or
Yeah.
maybe it is something more archaic, like there is just some weird interaction with that guard at the bottom there. But that this does also mark the point where I started to get that very first sense of like I just literally don't know what to do here, because even in the 20th anniversary edition, like even though that circuit is visible once you see it, I didn't register it as a thing I needed to shoot. So I spent a bunch of time
Mm.
bashing my head against that guard upstairs, just getting shot repeatedly over and over again, and just trying to ask myself like, what else could I possibly be doing in this space?
Yeah. Yeah, this was the point that I had to search for help. And I did. And I saw them do it on the Amiga version. And
Interesting.
even on the walkthrough, it didn't show obviously that there was any circuit damage there for him to be able to do it. He
Interesting.
just ran to the left and the guy didn't open the door and shoot. So I was like, that doesn't happen. So
Yeah,
that's when I
I
tried it in both
definitely
versions until it worked.
I definitely ended up using similarly like a video walkthrough for later sections of the game, but I'm struggling to remember like how. I think I must have just accidentally stumbled across and oh, I know, I remember what it was. At some point, you go upstairs to that second room, and there is a very visible, and again, this might just be specifically in the 20th anniversary edition, a very visible like power line that's like running below that
Mm-hmm.
upper floor guard's room. So at some point, you just realize, okay,
You could
this is
connect it
connected to the room
visually.
down below. Yeah, exactly.
So that part, that was tough. His first stuck point. Then there's like a cool little thing, right? You go into this duct system. Your
Yes.
buddy opens up the floor, which again for me was super annoying. Was this like a bother to you? I
It
died
was.
about 100 times in here.
This is probably the single screen in the entire game that I probably would have cut from it. Because it most lays bare kind of like the trial and error nature of the game of just like,
Mm-hmm.
am I going to go left? Am I going to go right? Am I going to fall to my death, or am I going to like fall a foot? And you don't know until you try one path versus the other. And that
Right.
just kind of felt
Because it's
like,
completely dark
exactly.
and you
You can't
have
even
a
see the
small
whole
circle.
layout. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the one part of the game that kind of lays bare like the artifice of like the trial and error nature of the game, and it kind of surprised me from a design perspective that you would put that in there.
Yeah. Maybe it's on purpose to say, look, this game is all about guessing what you have to do
Sure.
and learning from dying.
I know what this is. You know what this is. Let's just establish that and move past it.
Yeah. And then you're killed by dripping water in the background, which is
Yes.
not obvious. I'm like, oh, that kills me. Great. So now I have to roll past that. I go one way, I fall to my death. I go the other way, I fall an inch. Then you go down again. You go one way, you fall to your death. You go the other way, you fall 2 inches, and you're fine.
Hmm.
And you make it through. Very, very weird. Then we get mostly to that point that we were talking about before with that extensive puzzle that had a lot of cool things where you had to change the way that you would navigate the space.
Definitely. The first point of like, okay, wow, I wasn't expecting this, because, up until this point, the game has been fairly linear. Every puzzle kind of takes place over a couple of screens. But yeah, this is that part we were talking about earlier where suddenly you have a very, very elaborate sequence of puzzles that requires backtracking multiple times. And the order that you can kind of navigate and explore is is pretty much up to you, which I thought was kind of cool.
Hmm. Yeah, and it also introduced some more new and novel interactions with the environment, like shooting out the bottom of a teetering rock to help you
Yes.
climb back up, or jumping across a ledge by grabbing onto stalactites
Right. Or even just
that
like
you
right
didn't know you
before
could
that,
do.
like shooting at the bat to like startle it. Like little points of like, okay, I have a gun. What can I do with this gun that isn't just shooting enemies? Like, okay, here's some, like I said, some fun points of interaction where non-obvious ways that you can like interact with the environment.
Hmm. But this also had massive slowdown for me in the
Oh
Super
God.
Nintendo version that led to tons of deaths when we had the screen with these boulders falling from the ceiling in different areas. It
Right.
was, yeah, it was a struggle. Oh, and I actually didn't mention right before this part, there's a sort of mysterious way to proceed where I was stuck again. You jump off of a bridge that's blown out and you land on a ledge below, and below that is spikes, so you can't jump down there. And the wall to your right just looks like normal background wall. So eventually, over time, maybe you would get frustrated. There were a lot of times in old games when I would just get frustrated and like do things. This happened to me in Metroid, for example. I got to a door I couldn't open, and since I hadn't read the instruction manual, I didn't know that it takes 5 missiles to open this kind of door. So I just started pounding the missile button out of frustration, and the door opened. I'm like, let me check the instruction manual. Oh, yeah. In this case, you get to a wall. It's just a wall. But maybe you get frustrated and hold down your Mega Buster and shoot the wall. Or maybe you think to try it and shoot the wall and it explodes and you go through the secret door.
Is that the first point in the game that you have to use the Mega Blast, the charge up shot to like get through a wall?
To get through a wall, yes. But
Interesting.
you had to use it once previously to get through the very narrow sort of door, I think.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I think that must be right, because otherwise I don't know how I would have stumbled across that. Because the one thing I do remember about that section is like, you once you get to that bridge, you basically have two options, which is walk off and fall to your death, or jump down to this ledge below. And it kind of becomes apparent very quickly that you're supposed to be on that ledge below, and there's just nothing to do there. So I kind of went into old adventure game mindset of just use everything on everything. And yeah, I'm trying to think. I think I just kind of arbitrarily shot the supercharge at the wall, not really expecting it to work, and then similarly being surprised that it did.
Yeah. And just before that, actually, you get your first glimpse of this weird little system of reloading your gun, which seems super arbitrary throughout the game.
Yeah.
Like sometimes the gun runs out of ammo quickly and sometimes it goes forever.
I still don't think I really know what that's all about, because it's very clear at the start of the game that you have exactly one supercharge, and then you have to get the upgrade to be able to do multiple supercharges. But from that point on, it doesn't seem like did you ever run out? I don't think I ever did.
I don't know. It's weird. It almost seems like there are particular points where the game instructs itself to make it so you can't shoot anymore.
Oh, interesting. That
Based
could be
on
it.
progress rather than use. That's what it
That
felt
could be
like to me.
it. Yeah, I don't think I even came across a point where I was trying to use the supercharge and couldn't, which, again, it made those reload stations feel pretty arbitrary.
Yeah. So there was that. Maybe that was part of the way that you knew that you had to reuse the Super Blast. I don't know. It's hard to justify.
Sure.
But anyway, we fast forward a lot because we talked about that cave section and that being like a really interesting sequence of puzzles that was also super frustrating and kind of, opaque. And there was that, what I mentioned, there's like a little fight scene where you start walking out of the side of the screen and you get knocked down by one of the guards and your gun goes sliding across the floor and he picks you up, and then you just mash on the action button and kick him. And then if you go back to the left, you can pick up your gun, but this specific moment animates a roll to pick it up, and then you shoot it. It was super cool.
I loved that.
Right?
And
Yeah.
and I think the thing that kind of was great about that moment to me is when you think about the lineage of this type of game and where we've landed up, with stuff like what we would consider the modern cinematic action adventure games, stuff like Call of Duty that kind of kicked things off in a big way, and Uncharted, and these types of games. Like, this was like the point in this game that kind of felt like your guy doing cool stuff that kind of just was. It's very scripted, very like cinematic, very like outside of the mechanics of the game, as it were, but still just a little small moments where you're like, man, that was cool. I enjoyed watching that play out the way it did.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the next screen, you're immediately pincher attacked and die 100
Yes,
times.
exactly.
For me, anyway.
Well, I mean,
And
this is definitively like basically after that sequence, after you do the cool dude roll and shoot, this is the point in the game where I first evoked like the walkthrough to be like, there are too many people here that I just can't seem to defeat, can't seem to kill. And I was just getting frustrated at that section because it kind of also struck me as one of those things like, okay, you should have had your cool dude moment be the end of this sequence rather than just leading to a more frustrating like fight sequence.
yeah, at this point, I just took it as a sign that I would not go that way because there were other routes to go. So I went back in the other direction. You come back across your friend who's crawling through ducts himself.
Mm-hmm.
He can't get past. So you have to go back and knock out a chandelier that allows him to pass through because the chandelier's right below him. There's some more combat up there. And then you come to this big gap of emptiness if you hadn't knocked out the wall below, which is what happened to me. If you did it in the right order, it would be full of water. But I had to go up and go through these other sections and then realize, oh, now I have to go back to this pincher attack and figure out how to defeat these guys. And then I had to watch this walkthrough and just copy exactly what the guy did. Okay, I put up a shield here. I put up a shield behind me. Okay, I stick my gun out here. I shoot him. Okay, I put up a shield again. I look at this guy. I shoot. And even following it, move by move, it was really difficult to do because the controls were abysmal in terms of turning around, the character sliding a little bit too far when you pick up your gun, being in the right spot at the right time, positioning the muzzle of your gun in the right spot. So I would have died 100 times here and been sent back to the very beginning of the very first cave. When you first break through the wall after the leap to the ledge.
Got it. At the beginning of the cavern.
That's where it would reset you.
That is a level of frustration that I just cannot imagine dealing with if this had been your experience playing the game back in 1991. I cannot fathom anyone having a good time with that.
Unless it only did that to me because I hadn't knocked out the wall that the water was supposed to go to.
Maybe.
And otherwise it would have set me to the beginning past the waterfall in the building.
Possibly. I'd be curious to dig into that. Like, I think...
Yeah.
It resetting you back to the start of that screen would be pretty consistent with how the checkpointing had been up to that point, which is to say it always resets you to the beginning of each major like puzzle section. So I wonder.
Waterfall, pre-guard house, whatever it was.
Right.
That would have been much more tolerable.
Sure.
But as it was, I think at this point, after defeating these guys and figuring out that I had to go back and do the water puzzle, I might have sought out a code to go forward. Maybe. I don't remember exactly. Oh, yeah, that's right. Because I realized that I had to then go back all the way back down, do the bat thing and the tentacle thing, and jump across the stalactites. So I just found an access code for the next part. Good old DDRX. Then there's a swimming level.
Yeah.
How'd you feel about that? Since swimming levels are universally the worst part of most games.
I think realizing that there was a swimming level actually ends up taking more time than doing the swimming itself. Because I bashed my head against that section for ages with it before I realized that you could just swim down into the caverns. So yeah, you swim back through the caverns that you've just flooded, and it's kind of this cool, it's a little bit cool of the sequence of, these caverns that you have previously run through earlier in the game, and you're now swimming through them because they're flooded with water. I feel like I either got lucky and just managed to get through this in one take, but Is there like a very limited breath in this sequence? Because I didn't feel like I was struggling for air or anything like that.
I think there has to be because there's the one tunnel you go up and there's air at the top.
Exactly. I think I noticed that probably on my first swim down and was like, yeah, I'm going to go up there, get some air. But like, it doesn't seem like there's a lot to traverse beyond that. Exactly.
Yeah, this part was pretty straightforward, short, and it worked pretty well. He swam like in the direction you pointed him, and
right,
great. I don't even know what this electrical circuit you had to shoot down there did, because I did it before moving across. I'm assuming you swam across the water and got out on the other side.
Yes. So once you swim across, and again, I'm forgetting specifically what happens, but you swim out on the other side, and I guess there's just. Oh, I remember exactly what it is. So you swim out across this pool of water, and there's just like this drop down. And this is actually one of the parts where I really couldn't figure out if I was doing something wrong. If you drop down there, you basically just get shot from something like a laser off screen, like instantaneously. And I think that's what the circuit at the bottom does. It's I guess, just some sort of like automatic turret that is not really being depicted in any way in the game.
Yeah, I remember that part. That was right after there's a guard that you could have killed in advance by shooting out this eyeball thing from above, which I thought was really cool. And if you go and do that first, he'll be dead and smushed. But if you don't, he'll be there fighting you, and he's really hard to fight.
So
And then
that
you drop
is
down. I still had the blasters.
that is exactly the point of the game where I first used the walkthrough, because I don't know that there's any way to kill that guy without dropping the green thing on him. And I kept
Oh,
coming
yeah, I wouldn't
across
know.
those. Yeah, I tried a bunch of stuff trying to fight that guy, and he just kind of seemed impossible to kill. And you come across those green, let's call them like green chandelier type things, and you can shoot one of them out
Yeah.
to drop on top of him. But this is the part that kind of really messed with me. There's a very, very specific timing, and it's not very clear what that timing is until the walkthrough basically explains, like, oh, you can see the reflection of the guy on the bottom of the chandelier, and when it's at the bottom, you have to shoot it so it drops on top of him. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry, guy. If it had not been for your walkthrough, all of that would have been lost on me.
Oh, is that what that's supposed to be? So I ran
Yes.
into that first. I ran into that and saw it, and I walked up to the gap, and some laser beam came up at me from below at an angle, and that ruined that puzzle. I had to restart. Then I went in again, and I just kind of ducked, and I saw this, a few pixels rotating along the bottom of this green circle. I thought that was a biological thing looking at the guy, which, it's the same effect. It says, oh, he's right below now, so now's the time. I shot
That's
it,
funny.
it falls, it makes a noise. You don't see the guy, but from the noise and that reflection, I guess is what it really is, because it does make more of a glass crashing sound than anything else.
Yeah.
I shot it, it failed, it killed the guy.
So yeah, for whatever reason, that brown smudge on the bottom just wasn't registering to me as anything. So yeah, the idea that there was even a timing component to that was just completely lost on me.
Oh, and then you had this impenetrable wall of a guard.
Totally. And here's the thing, because the other side of this, right, is that until this point, other than the cool moment where you roll away from the guy, there is no guard in the game that just isn't beatable through the mechanics of the combat. So being presented with one that just mysteriously didn't seem to be killable, and then also having what seemed like an arbitrary puzzle, it's kind of that very like classic, am I just doing something wrong here, or is there just something I'm not getting? And not knowing whether it's a failure of like execution or a failure of like, puzzle design, like that felt like the first most egregious spot to me.
Yeah, that's super annoying. Yeah, I just came across it and he was dead, and I was like, hey, there's that thing that I did. But then it reloaded later for whatever reason, and he was alive. Oh, no, I'm wrong. This was where I used that access code, and I came upon him and he was alive, but I saw the chandelier in that room with him, a different one, and I was like, oh, it reset my thing. So I went all the way back and redid it, knowing that this art asset matches those art assets, so he should be dead, because he's too hard to fight. So I went back, did that, and sure enough, he was dead. Then I advanced, and then we come down, and there's that big blaster part, which, by the way, the blasters were still there for me, even though I hit the electrical thing, so I still don't know what that does, the electrical thing underwater. Totally.
And I think that's a little bit confusing, because my sense, at least my internal idea of how this works, is there's some sort of like automatic sentry or something that shoots you if you don't hit that switch. But when you land in there, you kind of see like a wall blow out to your left, and then a lot of guards just start shooting at you. So it's kind of this really confusing message where it's kind of like, okay, you got to destroy this like automated system, but you're still going to get shot at. But then only at that point are you allowed to actually progress the sequence by like running off to the right.
I mean, that feels in line with the game's design.
Sure. And for what it's worth, that sequence is actually pretty cool where you're just kind of like running past all of these automatic doors while like a ton of lasers are just firing at you from the left-hand side.
And then what happens at the end of this hall? You hit a dead end.
Oh, yeah, right. So you slowly, as you're running through the corridor, you notice like at the top of the screen, your buddy who you've like freed through the vents earlier in the level is kind of slowly crawling along you. And once you get to the end of the corridor, there's clearly no way out except for what looks like a hatch in the ceiling. And you kind of get the sense like, okay, if I wait here long enough, my buddy's going to rescue me. You're kind of just like holding out there, using your shield, desperately trying to shoot things until eventually he pulls you up through the hatch in the ceiling and gets you out of there, which I thought was pretty cool. Kind of reaffirmed kind of like this fun little dynamic you have with your one little friend in this weird place.
Yeah, this buddy cop movie that you're in. And guess what? This is the end of the game, as designed in 1991 for the Amiga. Well, it's close. You go up and you get into the sort of end sequence with the Colosseum, which we'll get to. And then after that, you go up and, you finish. It's not the end. It skips a huge portion that was added in the MS-DOS and home console versions, which is like a really cool part because he was criticized, the designer, for it being too short. So he created this whole new part and added it into the future versions. But the original Amiga skips over it and goes straight to a much later section and just a few more scenes. And then the game ends. But
that's really fascinating.
As for us, we get to some of the coolest things, right?
Yeah, because actually, to some extent, like these are the more elaborate environments and like, there are some fun interactions and puzzles in this sequence that it's kind of strange to me to even imagine that they weren't there in the original game. That's cool.
Yeah, and knowing that history, you can kind of understand that it seems like the designer had some time away from the game, had some time to look at it and evaluate it and come back and do new things with his same system.
Right.
Okay, but for every other version of the game besides the Amiga and the Atari ST, we now go on to this other section. And instead of going up to what will be a weird tank, here you go up and end up at the top of an elevator on just a rooftop or something, and you have to enter what seems like a little guardhouse. And this was this is one of my favorite parts of the game right here.
This specific puzzle is one of those things where I just kind of thank everything that I just lucked into the solution. So what happens is you come up to you got your little buddy tagging along with you, and you come up to a guardhouse, and as soon as you enter, you're basically attacked by two guys that there's no real plausible way that you can get in and out unscathed without getting killed, because your guy just basically gets like sort of tackled by one of them very quickly, and then the other guy in the guard room just shoots you. But there is a little back route around the guardhouse through actually kind of one of the, let's call it a mechanic that is maybe one of the least well implemented in the game, which is sometimes the environments kind of have dimensionality to them. Like you can walk upstairs, vault onto platforms, but getting up and out of onto those platforms is kind of like this exercise in, man, I hope this will sometimes work. Sometimes you'll jump and you'll end up on the platform. Sometimes you jump and you won't. And I just happened to accidentally jump onto this platform before I even realized there was a puzzle solution here. And I can only imagine that if that hadn't happened, I would never have stumbled across that solution without a walkthrough.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I walked into the house, got killed, restarted, and said, let me try to go left. There was nothing left, so just by moving back right, I guess my toe caught the little ramp up that put me in the background.
It could well be that is a concession that like I hadn't noticed, which is, maybe if you walk all the way to the left and then back right, then you just automatically get up onto that platform. That could be the intended design, I suppose. It's interesting. But yeah, you walk along the back of this platform, which kind of takes you behind the guardhouse, which, as you can now imagine, allows you to get the drop on the guys inside, which is, I thought, was pretty clever little solution.
Yeah. It's super cool too, the way that it's animated, because once you come in the back door blasting, the guard's attention shifts to you for a second, which allows your buddy to knock down the other guy and
Right.
punch him on the ground. It's a really like cool little sequence, little cinematic. I like that. Then this next part, what is the next part?
I think that's when you get right down into the drop where the awnings are, right? So you kind of come to this like little gap, like this, at this edge of a, let's call it a cliff, and another one of those drops. That if you drop down, you just kind of smash your brain on the bottom. But if you do it correctly, you're sort of waiting for your buddy to help you across, and he kind of throws you. So he throws you across the gap. Attempts to jump across himself, but ends up sort of falling a little short, hanging from this awning. And I probably spent way too much time trying to figure out how to rescue him before realizing you just sort of have to jump back across the gap to another awning that's lower down. And it's kind of this odd little sequence because your buddy is just kind of like indefinitely hanging from that awning until you solve a whole bunch of puzzles to get back to him.
Yeah, he has some incredible grip strength and
Right.
endurance. It's great. Funny thing about this awning is you come to this gap and you see the awning, and I just immediately thought I definitely have to jump and bounce off that awning. So I jumped and fell to my death.
Yep.
And I saw the other awning on my way down to my death. Then I walked to the edge and I just stood there thinking, what could happen? And that's when the game, the time of the game progresses and he walks over and throws you.
Got it.
That's how I found out. And then from there, I figured, I'll try to jump across and land on that other awning that I saw below. And you kind of smash through it and it swings down and you end up on a platform below to the left.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a shootout there, and then you get into what is again probably one of the more elaborate, little intricate puzzle sequences. Like it's probably only, if I count quick, maybe 1, 2, 3 different screens, but there's a very specific like precision to the order of events that has to happen, which I thought was, in retrospect, having struggled through it, pretty clever, but was pretty frustrating at the time.
Yeah, it also incorporates an action and response from the game that has never happened before, and it's weird to see it. I think I may have been stuck and had to, I wrote down stuck. I write down stuck wherever I had to get answers. So you go through, there's like a little sequence where guys are running out of a room, but one guy is left behind. And if you shoot him, it ruins the puzzle. You can't progress much later on in this sequence. So you have to hold him up at gunpoint. And he like puts his hands up and presses a button on the ceiling that closes the door to lock you out. And that is not telegraphed in any way.
Yeah.
So interesting. And the reason it doesn't work if you don't do that is because you then have to circle back around and go above there and come down a teleporter that will put you right in the line of fire to get instantly shot by someone else if he hadn't closed those doors in advance.
Yeah, so this is one of the points in the game where I think the first time I interacted with that guy, I think I inadvertently triggered the hold up thing you described. He does the thing, he pushes the button, but executing the rest of that puzzle would have been like almost impossible in the first attempt. So like I failed spectacularly after that, and then trying to replicate that down at the bottom was kind of where I hit this brick wall of like, what did I do that first time that like triggered him to push that button?
Oh yeah.
And this is one of those.
That door?
Yeah, exactly. Why was this door closed the first time I did this versus all these other times? And that was another point where only through looking at the walkthrough and realizing that there was this kind of like hold up interaction, which again didn't register the first time I played it. But it's one of those things where it's a good example of the game using a very, very, very small set of interactions, a very small set of mechanics to do something that feels different within the context of stuff you've done before. But again, it's not, I just can't help but think that if this was a more modern game, that would have been communicated at some point earlier in the game. Like, hey, you have to hold up this guy to progress,
Yeah. There would definitely be some way. Or they would have just chosen a different thing to do.
Sure. Yeah.
Or they would have put it in a cutscene.
Right. Exactly.
There's another part of this that is also very opaque.
Yes. I kind of loved this one. you do this thing, you hold up this guy, he basically locks these doors above you. Now, before that, you kind of head up these stairs to another guard that you have to get past. And this guard's actually fairly trivial, just to like shoot and progress onwards. But if you do that, you're going to be stuck and not able to progress. So here's one of the things that I kind of discovered by accident. So you come up those stairs, and there's not many guards that do this in the game, but there's at least one earlier in the first major prison sequence that, if you have your shield up, will start throwing grenades at you, and they kind of just hit you and you blow up. Oh, actually, this is actually a puzzle earlier in the game where
they
you
like roll along the floor.
Exactly, and you sort of have to have the door block, and it bounces off and like kills the guy. But the way that works in this one is, if you jump across the stairs, you're basically on the other side of this gap, and basically the grenades don't hit you; they just roll down the stairs. And that kind of feels like this fun, like, I'm tricking you, you're throwing grenades at me, but they're not getting me. You shoot him and move on with your life. But one of the things I kind of noticed is, if you double back down to the bottom of those stairs, there is like a small pit that's being blown up at the bottom of the stairs by virtue of the fact that the grenades have rolled down the stairs. But you have to allow several grenades to roll down the stairs to make that pit large enough that you can actually use it later on in the puzzle. And that took a while to realize.
Oh, does each one progressively make it bigger? Like,
yeah,
did you let one down and then see a small gap, and then
it literally was
down?
Several times of like noticing, wait, there was no pit here before. Now there's two pits. Now there's one. So realizing that there was some sort of like dynamicism to it, because the only thing that kind of clicked in my head of like, oh, this takes multiple grenades. I think it's like 4. I think it's probably at least 4 before that basically blasts all the way through the floor.
Wow. And there's really no way to know that is what you need to do. It's just a consequence, like a happy accident of using the stairway to avoid the grenades.
Absolutely. Because it's also, it's happening off screen. Like, these grenades roll down the stairs into a screen that you're not able to see. And it's only when you go back there and see the results of the grenade that you can make any sort of conclusion about that.
Yeah. And video games of this era had this sort of object permanence issue where if it goes off the screen, it doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly. So even just the idea, which, come to think of it, is in some ways pretty smart, that the idea that any of these puzzles could be solved by objects that were effectively leaving the screen was pretty novel, at least.
Yeah. At least we saw this a little bit earlier with the chandelier, the off-screen thing.
Oh, right.
But still, it's not a lot of puzzles, but just a few.
Yeah.
So yeah, I got stuck there and I had to see, oh, okay, this opens up a hole in the floor, but I don't know why, because these things roll across the floor. Why did it explode this part of the floor? I don't know. So you continue, you go down, you finish this other guard, you destroy a little electronic circuit, and then you go down that hole.
Yes.
This is where you're in a dark room.
You turn off this switch, and then you end up in this dark room, running across this grate with like lasers shooting up out of you. And yeah, then you get out of that room, and that's when you're reunited with your buddy, like right after that?
So after that, you have to pull a switch in the next room that lets these beasts out of the cages below,
right,
and causes all this mayhem. But that black screen was so cool to me.
Yeah.
Because sometimes the Super Nintendo version took a while to load the next area. So when I went through to this area and it was all black, I just waited. But the music was going, and I was like, let me press a button. And I shot, and the whole screen lit up from the light from my blasters.
Yeah.
But because I shot, now these lasers were coming up at an angle from under the grate.
Right.
And I was dead if I tried to advance. So what you have to do is not shoot and just run across, and now they're shooting vertically and making the screen flash as you run across, and it's super cinematic.
That is actually pretty sad, because I think that's one of those things that kind of just didn't register for me, because I just accidentally stumbled past that screen and solved it in one go. So I didn't get that much like interaction with that room as such. I had the same experience you had of walking into like a pitch black room and being like, is this just not loading? Is something going wrong? And then you hit the run key, and then you start running across and you see all the laser fire come up. But yeah, I was just able to get across that grate on the first attempt. But even then, that brief exposure to like the dark room being lit up by the blast rays was very, very cool. And just like to think that this is happening on like technology that can barely do anything with lighting or any sort of effect like that. It's just really, really cool. I was able to like replicate that look.
Yeah, I liked that. So yeah, the next part, if you're running too fast, like through that dark part, you'll fall immediately in the next room and you'll miss the lever, which is what happened to me. And you get to a screen where to the left, there's 100 guards, and to the right, there's a lot of guards. And I spent a while trying to go back and forth and kite them into the middle screen to try to fight them one at a time, but their numbers never reduced. And in the background, you have these cages with those beasts from earlier in the game, from the first scene. So I was stuck. So
interesting. Yeah, I think I just
part.
completely glossed over all of that. Like you obviously you pull the lever and see all the beasts get released, but I had no context for that scene because I think I just stumbled my way through it.
Oh, you got the lever first.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's pretty peaceful down there, except guards on the two screens to the left and right. But obviously, when you hit that lever, they are getting decimated by these beasts.
It's that classic, like they have all the beasts sort of caged up, and then you release them, and they're just kind of being mauled left, right, and center, and you're escaping in the chaos.
Yeah, with gunfire everywhere.
Yeah.
Anyway, you run to the right. You go up and you can finally reach your buddy.
Right. Who has been hanging on for dear life this entire time.
Yeah, so then you go up another elevator and now we're reunited with the Amiga version. This is where you go and you just suddenly walk into a tank and it drives out into a coliseum.
Yeah.
And it's really strange to me. Like, a really jarring transition thematically or as far as the story goes.
It's really funny because the little cinematic that leads you getting into the tank is this very self-serious, like, you see your character like in like sort of ascending up into this light as this like glass shield sort of appears in front of him and all the controls light up, and it's very, like you said, it's just very jarring. I'm like, wait, no, what's happening now? And then suddenly this tank rolls out onto screen in the middle of this coliseum full of aliens. Very bizarre.
Yeah, when I saw him emerging into this sort of astronaut bubble, I thought it was going to be the end of the game. Like, this tank was going to drive away. It was going to be the end. But then you get to this weird scene where it's a giant picture of the tank in this coliseum, bullets and missiles and things flying all around, and a small picture-in-picture on the top left where you have to move your finger around and press a bunch of buttons.
Right.
And I just think you just have to press all of them. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any rhyme or reason to the sequence. I definitely failed it once or twice. Like if you don't hit the buttons quickly enough, you eventually just get blown up. But yeah, eventually you kind of you're moving around hitting buttons until there's one that like lights up and starts flashing in the middle of the panel, and then you hit that, and that's what triggers the next bit where you basically get jetted out of the tank in these escape pods.
Yeah, so you're ejected and you land in.
You land in one of the most bizarre visuals of this bathhouse with this assemblage of presumably female aliens, like all kind of with their backs to camera, butt cracks slightly showing, like in this like very weirdly, vaguely lewd scene, but not really.
Super naked in a bathhouse with butt cracks, and you just land there and run away. More guns are shooting again.
I did find one really fun little anecdote about this in like one of the talks that Eric Shahi gave, which is this is the one sequence that they had to censor slightly for, I think it was maybe the Super Nintendo release or some of the releases where they like literally, yeah, probably, where they just literally sort of painted out the butt cracks from them, which I thought was a hilarious little touch of just very bizarre censorship.
Weird scene. This series of weird transitions. I mean, I guess it is movie like the action comedy genre of
Yeah,
movies. The
exactly.
heroes will find themselves going through a door and end up like on stage at a convention or something. You know, you're just in a
Right.
totally different place than you expected.
It does seem like this is like the biggest, most jarring like tonal shift in the game. Like listen, like starting with the tank coliseum sequence, like it's pretty like moody and atmospheric up until this point, but then it just basically becomes like an all-out action sequence from here on out.
Yeah. So now you're running away. You have the floor blown out from under you. You fall. You think your buddy grabs you to save you, but it's a completely different background when you're picked up. And it's a different guy with red eyes and kicks you right in the face.
Mm-hmm.
You move to the next screen and you're just on the ground. And then what happens?
Yeah, so you're basically watching your buddy and this kind of his big bad enemy with the red eyes kind of brutally sort of punch each other out on the floor next to you. You're kind of all battered and bruised at this point. You're lying on the floor. All you can really do is slowly crawl all the way to the right of the screen. And I mean really slowly. It's probably like a solid minute of you just holding right, crawling to the right while your buddy just gets punched out to the left of you. You eventually make your way to like this panel of levers on the right hand side, and just as you get there, your buddy is effectively like at least knocked out or dazed. The big bad sort of gets up and starts walking towards you, and you pull the lever, and he gets obliterated by this beam of light in the ceiling.
You pull another lever, and the ceiling opens up, and you have to crawl back, and you get tractor beamed up, I guess,
Yeah.
to the roof.
And I guess that's officially the end of the game. Like, there's no real gameplay after this point. Your buddy comes up with you. There's a dragon on the roof for some reason, and you fly off together into the sunset.
Yeah, and you have no idea where you're going or how to get back to Earth. That's it. Fly off into the sunset, and that's the game.
I thought it was kind of an odd ending because, like, kind of like you said, like it doesn't necessarily give you any closure on like getting back home. It kind of feels like the obvious step would be, you get teleported to the strange world. The aim is to get back to your world, but it kind of just has this very open-ended, you going off with your alien friend, flying on the back of a dragon to who knows where.
Yeah. So ultimately, after this very different experience, at least for me, it was a very different experience. What did you come away with? What are your thoughts here?
So a few things. It's hard, right? Because like it was a game that I had a lot of frustrations with playing, but there's a thing that I so appreciated about my time with it, which was kind of the thing I said right at the start of the episode, which was just the way that this ties into some of my favorite games, some of my favorite genres. Like we spoke about Limbo and Inside. You've played Inside, right?
No, I played Limbo though and loved it.
Oh my gosh, you have to play Inside. So look, I don't know. Do you like Limbo?
Yeah, loved it.
If you loved Limbo, Inside is absolutely, and I say this, with 100% sincerity, Inside is probably like a top 10 game for me. It is phenomenal. It's effectively a spiritual successor to Limbo. There's no real connective tissue, but the gameplay is very similar, which is to say it's this style of game. It's a cinematic story game where the mechanics are purely running and jumping and like a series of 2D puzzle screens. And like the lineage from Another World to something like Inside, which like I said has become one of my favorite games, is so striking and so clear. Like Inside and Limbo kind of make the concessions of modern game design, of like kind of a lot of the stuff we've been talking along the way of, hey, are we making sure that we're signposting some of these puzzles better? Are we making sure that if we have an idea that's going to have to pay off in a big puzzle, that we're communicating that idea? And Inside does that really well. Totally. And it makes a huge difference. Like you never feel like cheated by a puzzle in this series of games. And it's one of those things that you kind of had to make the missteps that Another World makes in order to get to that point to realize, like, yeah, no, not everyone wants to bash their head against a puzzle for days on end before they feel like they can progress. At the very least, I feel like what I came away with from playing Another World was both seeing the genesis of a genre of game that I like a lot, but also kind of seeing the pitfalls and kind of seeing like what we had to change to get to where we are now, you know?
Yeah. I definitely feel very similar in that way. It was, if not fun the whole time, it was most certainly interesting and enlightening.
Exactly.
Right?
That's exactly
Yeah.
it. And a lot of the time, that's what I want from like an older video game experience. I know that it's not necessarily going to excite me in the way that I appreciate by games that are more recent in my memory or closer to like my actual point of nostalgia, like even later adventure games, because my bread and butter of my youth were the series of adventure games that kind of followed this. Like once you get into kind of the LucasArts staples, like in the early to mid 90s, like that's closer to like the nostalgia I have for this genre. But again, you had to have experiences like this, experiences like Dragon's Lair, to get there, to get to finding where the fun is and removing the frustration.
Yeah, this one seems to use some of the realities of that adventure genre in combination with the direction it is ultimately aiming to go, which is sort of limbo. So it has
Totally.
that vestigial stuff.
Also, one thing that we never maybe really like said explicitly, but like, you know, this game has no dialogue, barely has any text on screen, has no interface. Like it's
Oh,
pretty
very true.
pure in its presentation. Like it's just the visuals of the world and all the detail is sort of filled in by your imagination. Like, you know, there's an elaborate, beautiful music score and beautiful sound effects. I don't know how they would have sounded on the original versions. I guess you can allude to that more, but it's very minimalist with like how it presents itself, and it does a lot with very, very little.
For sure. There is some vocalization by the enemies, but it's unintelligible alien
Right.
speak. And as for the music, actually, that's an interesting point. The version you played doesn't have some of the music that was added to the Interplay versions that was also very, very good and played during some of the action sequences, like the entire last part where your guy is dangling on the canopy and the
Right.
whole portion where you're running away from the water. There's intense action music, and I actually put it in my notes. I said, the action music is awesome! Exclamation point.
That's a bummer. Why did they take it out of the later versions?
I guess for purity of the original design, but they kept in his later levels. But I guess that's because the original designer added those later levels,
That's
whereas
true.
the music was added by Interplay's composer.
Oh, I see. So these action music pieces weren't in the original game.
Right. They were not in
Got
the
it.
Amiga version.
it.
They were added for the Interplay versions.
I see.
And even Interplay wanted him to change the opening music, and he outright refused and sent an infinite loop fax to them saying, I will not change the music. I will not change the music. I will not change the music.
That's incredible.
And Delphine Software said to them that they cannot demand that legally, so they stopped trying.
That's amazing.
But the music was great. The original music by the original composer was great, and the additional music by the new composer was also great. But I prefer it with the additional music. Overall, my experience was a roller coaster of emotion. The whole time I was ready, not the whole time, but like the first half, I was ready to just say, this game's terrible, leave it in the past. Seriously. And, you know, I take pride in being able to recognize a game's value when other people are not. And I was going to be one of those voices that said, no, this is old and garbage. But as I made it through to the end, my opinions slowly shifted, saying, wow, there's a lot of value in this, and I definitely understand its place in history. So I don't know what to say about it, because I always do like to, at the end of the show, recommend whether people should play it. Now, ideally, people have been playing it so that they're preparing for the show and they aren't spoiled by all this, but we would have experienced it together like a book club and they can send in comments. But for anyone who hasn't, I'd like to be able to say, yeah, definitely go play this game, or no, probably not. And it's oftentimes, if I had played the game in the past, it's thinking about, does my memory match up with the reality of playing it today? In this case, it's a first play, so it's more of just saying, was it worth going back to play in 2022 when it came out in 1991? And I almost don't know what to say. It's really hard.
I find myself in a similar position of just not really knowing how to recommend it to people, or whether to recommend it to people. Like, I think based on stuff we've said, you kind of will get a sense of like if it's something that makes sense to you. Like, so much of the reason I play older games is to understand their place in like a lineage of games, you know? And like this feels absolutely pivotal in that sort of a conversation. Like if you want to see where cinematic adventure games came from, you need to play this game.
Yeah.
But
monumentally influential.
Absolutely. And you know, let's talk about some of the influence. Like I remember seeing that, you know, so people like Kojima cited as like inspiration for Metal Gear Solid, Ueda for Eco and Shadow of the Colossus. Like these are the sorts of modern day experiences that to some extent are inspired by Another World. And like that's huge. Like when you think about
not inconsequential designers.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's one of those things where it's like you have to be prepared to put yourself in a time and place where this level of frustration was kind of the norm. And you sort of have to be okay with saying like, hey, some of these puzzles are going to be insurmountable and you might just need to walk through to get through them. Having played it that way, you know, just looking up stuff where I got stuck, I did not have a bad time with this. There are frustrating sequences. It is forgivably short for a game that could have been much, much more frustrating if it was much, much longer. I feel like I couldn't give you a blanket recommendation whether it's worth playing or not. But if that sounds like the sort of thing that is important to you in terms of like identifying where it sits in like a design space, then maybe.
Oh boy, it's a tough one because what I've done is on the Smashing Bricks retro list, I've put columns for thumbs up or thumbs down from me and my guest. And in order for it to pass, it has to get a thumbs up from both of us. Yeah. It's the classic 2-star rating. Now, if we both say no, that's one thing. But I'm realizing as you talked, yeah, go ahead.
Here's what I'm gonna say. Like, I'm gonna say it's a thumbs up for me. But like, but bearing in mind that that's a very personal perspective. You know, like it's hard not to recommend something without trying to consider like the average person, you know, like how they will react to it. But unabashedly, from my perspective, I am absolutely thrilled that I played this. I'm glad I did. And if you're anything like me, I guess you should play it.
Okay. And I would say about the original releases in the early 90s, no. However,
fair point.
However, we do have the 20th anniversary edition that you played as your first play with these concessions made for the modern gamer that vastly improve the experience. The checkpointing that makes you repeat far, far less of the game. The updated graphics, which we barely mentioned. You press a button and it shifts to these HD drawn graphics for the backgrounds that are absolutely beautiful. The controls that are actually smooth. That's a big deal. The difference between playing the Super Nintendo version and then the little improvement of the Genesis version, and from what I hear, the Amiga version was also pretty smooth, versus the 2013 Steam version on your beefy gaming PC in 2022, it runs like butter, and your character responds to every input the correct way. And you said maybe not exactly, but compared to the old versions, it's like night and day. and there's no
Sure.
slowdown. There's none of that garbage to deal with. And again, coming back to it for the 50th time, the checkpointing and the not repeating large swaths of gameplay that is all frustrating. Knowing that and caveating with the fact that this version exists and this is the only version that I would recommend playing, I think I'm allowed to do that because it's my podcast. So if you're listening, know that the 20th anniversary edition will get the thumbs up. So I'm going to call it more of a smash than a brick for its importance in gaming history and for the fact that it exists in this better form now. Which makes it 2 thumbs up, I guess.
Yeah, the most sort of like caveated, like tentative thumbs up ever, but yeah, 2 thumbs up.
Yeah. Don't play the Super Nintendo version ever. Please.
I will say one thing that this did really kind of cement for me, because there aren't really that many games that kind of approach this sort of purity of design. Like, you know, Limbo and Inside are kind of really the only modern things that really are that close. It did make me feel like glad that there was another one that I had now played, and really made me wish that I'd like to see more. I love like how much you can do with just kind of this minimalist 2D side-scrolling puzzle solving, and I'd love to see a lot more of them.
Yeah. There might be more out there from indie designers that just didn't get the press.
Oh, I'm sure there are. And you know, like I can definitely think of some that like lean more into like the puzzle realm, like stuff like The Swapper, but I think maybe on a purely cinematic storytelling perspective, probably less so, but I'd be curious.
I wonder how easy it would be to hunt through Steam tags starting with this 20th anniversary edition and Limbo and Inside and see what comes up in the search. Anyway, that's going to do it for us for this episode, huh? Can we know where to go find you, Neilan?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So I have a podcast that I do with my friends Mark, Helen, and Christina. It is a board game podcast called Board Game Barrage. You can find it on any, you know, wherever you find podcasts, or on our website, boardgamebarrage.com.
Awesome. And of course, if you're just stumbling across Smashing Bricks, you can do the same thing. Search for it on any podcasting platform, but our home is at anchor.fm/smashingbricks, and we're on Instagram at smashingbricks and Twitter at smashing_bricks. Also, I do have the Smashing Bricks retro games list that is available in a link in the description, so go check that out. If there's any game that you think should be included for a future episode, drop me an email at smashingbrickspodcast@gmail.com, and I'll get that added, and maybe we'll get to play it on a future episode. And of course, also at that email address, send in your thoughts about Another World, or any of the previous games we've played, or the next game that we're going to play, which I can reveal right now. The next game on Smashing Bricks episode 12 is going to be Comix Zone on the Sega Genesis with guest Kyle Stallock, an old friend from my GamerNode days. So get yourself a copy of that, or pick up a Genesis Mini and play that one and be ready for episode 12. Did you ever play that one, Neilan?
I haven't, no. Like, I have that era of video gaming for me is pretty much purely relegated to the PC, unfortunately.
Well, Neilan, just like the other listeners, if you want to get your hands on it, find something to play along, and then listen for the next episode, you are welcome to.
Absolutely.
And send in your commentary.
I will.
Awesome. And thanks so much for joining me. This has been great. I really loved going through this with you. I loved your insights and your experiences, and I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun to do. Having an excuse to play a game that's been on my shortlist for such a long time was amazing, and getting the chance to talk about it, awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. All right, and that's it, folks. As always, I'm Eddie Inzauto. Thanks for listening, and until next time, may the nostalgia be with you.